What's going on, everybody? Welcome to the Blazers Edge podcast. I am your host, Danny Marang, and this week I am joined by the homie. I don't know. Every time we do this, we're just like, "Hey, what's his title again?" It's Dave. Dave Deckard, obviously, is the OG, and he is the Grand Poobah. So, are you the Poobah?
I'm not. Yeah, I'm the understudy.
the non-grand Poobah so far. But thanks for joining me, man. Obviously, we're having you on because, hey, the season's coming back, and let's see, it's a Sunday. Let me go ahead and do the math. The draft is around the corner, and so we're going to focus a lot on the NBA draft, which obviously you and a bunch of the other guys on the site have been releasing draft profiles. We'll get into some of those. We'll take a bunch of questions. I think we got 9 to go through. Thank you very much for getting those in. A couple of them are going to carry us through some pretty heavy stuff, but it's been a little while since you had you on. Let's get your initial reaction to the season coming back December 22nd. Literally, NBA basketball is 6 weeks away, which is insane to think about. Just kind of overall, what's your takeaway of everything that's kind of happened and transpired in the past, 2-3 weeks?
I mean, it's shocking to see how fast it's come together and both sides come to an agreement on this. Like, I think there's incentive for both sides to come to an agreement quickly here and just kind of get this season out of the way. And then hopefully, we're back to a somewhat normal environment after that. Hopefully, fingers crossed.
Yeah.
So as a blogger, I couldn't ask for a better timeline because I used up all my off-season content during the hiatus. So I'm literally was banging my head. Well, not literally, but figuratively banging my head against the wall is what I was going to put out.
Should we tell everybody about our secret book?
Go ahead.
For everybody wondering, it does actually exist. We do have a book of off-season content ideas. What is it? It's like 100+ ideas now, right?
Yeah, it's a monster. I think it was started by Tim and Dave. Potentially, I mean, it's so old. It probably could have been started by Ben.
No, legitimately. It's 10 years old.
Which today, happy birthday, Ben Gall.
Yeah, shout out Ben. It is his birthday. Yep.
So, happy birthday from your former.
But for everybody wondering, this is just something they had to gin up for the off season. It's kind of true, but not really, because we have this stuff literally written down. So we're like, hey, it's a really slow day or week. We can actually pull something from this, maybe. And there's stuff in there we still haven't done. By the way.
Oh yeah.
there's levels of desperation.
Well, I mean,
the content matrix.
I've always not to look too far behind the curtain, but I have a lot of pre-made Kevin Love traded to Blazers type articles that I almost want to put, because I wrote that article probably 6 times since I started writing, and
I won't do it just on principle.
I kind of want to just release them in a series and just show how it evolves. But from
it's not a bad deal to why are we still talking about this? Yeah. The levels. Yeah. It sort of got. I saw somebody put it on the timeline the day before yesterday, and I was like, "We're not doing this, are we? Are we really? We're well beyond this. He's not washed. It's the same thing with Carmelo. It was they were never washed, but the whole idea of getting him in his contract. This was always the fear with Kevin Love, right? When they're talking about this trade 3-4 years ago, getting to this point, this Kevin Love, it doesn't help anything. So,
no.
But I'm not going to go down this road. I'm not going to do it.
We're already too far. We're already too far down the road. We got to go.
All right, let's flip it over to the draft, because that's what's crazy here. What has it been like trying to scout these guys, talk to agents, get feedback, and kind of keep track of this entire process? Because even though we're obviously not in the front office, we're still dealing with the same kinds of things where we're trying to get information. There's smoke screens going out there. There's guys like LaMelo Ball who could easily fall out of the top 10. That is as crazy as that may have sounded to anybody else out there. There's certainly teams that would take him 1 and 2, and there are teams that wouldn't touch him with a 10-foot pole. That's the variance we're dealing with. But being able to get intel about who guys are, where they're at right now, 7 months worth of workouts that they're able to put in between. What's that entire process been like for you to kind of go through this maturation of this draft cycle?
Well, I think with me is I'm normally on pace. I started a draft book on a lot of these guys a year before they come out, and just it's notes, because I spent a lot of time watching college basketball. I almost watch more college basketball than I watch pro basketball outside of the Blazers. So I'm keeping notes there. Obviously, this year we're at a very different environment. You're not seeing, especially these smaller college guys, get the opportunity to play in the tournament and play against top-level talent. So that definitely has been – it's been a lot harder to evaluate these mid-major guys. That said, there's a lot of really good international players in this draft class stashed between like all the way from 2 to second round guys. And those guys, luckily, there's a huge bank of available games that you can find, whether from international competitions or their domestic leagues that they're in overseas. So those guys I have a really good read on. I mean, I've been a huge Denny fan since, you and I have been talking about
him for about 18 months. So
so I'm enamored with his game. But I think the real, like, kind of the hard thing that I've gone through is what have the guys worked on since we've seen them last?
Yes.
And there's a lot of guys that have reworked their shots, and some of it looks better.
Some of it does not.
Considerably worse. So, and a lot of the times I really don't buy into that. I mean, jumpers in an empty gym or jumpers in an empty gym. I mean,
if your jumper starts looking like mine, though, you have problems.
Yeah.
Let's preface it that way.
So, and really, it's the agents in this process, from what I've talked to, it's been very different, but not necessarily all for the worse. I think there's certain agencies that have a larger client pool, and those guys have been able to work out against each other, and that's a major advantage. But also in this evaluation process, I think more guys are getting looks. And as far as like being able to get tape in and go, and not everything is revolving around getting 6 guys into your facility and 6 guys out of your facility, and that constant churn where some guys can get left behind when you're targeting just a targeted group of like 24 guys. I think
teams are lasering in.
Yeah. Well, I think they have looked at a larger pool of players because of this process of being able to pop tape in, and setting up a Zoom call is a lot different than flying a prospect in for a one-on-one meeting. So I think from what I've understood from some of the smaller agents that I've talked to or who have a smaller client pool, they've said that they've actually had a lot more direct contact with a lot more teams than they normally would have in this process.
I would estimate that you are going to see the difference between good front offices and bad front offices show much more in this draft than you otherwise would. Because like you said, there's more guys reaching out, more GMs, more front offices are certainly taking blinders off. We've seen franchises in the past get enamored with March Madness performances.
Mm-hmm. Some right, some wrong. I mean, Ja Morant, definitely right. But there's other guys where, I mean, we're still waiting on Shabazz Napier to keep LeBron James in a certain city.
So I mean, it's one of those things where I think every year there's a lot of stock put in guys like that otherwise shouldn't be. It's the whole idea of like, you are what your tape says. Like, you've got 5 months of doing this, but you have 3 weeks of doing this, and all of a sudden there's so much weight put on this because they did it under the microscope, and it's like, maybe he just got hot. Like, that's the let's flip in, go into the draft part of this specifically. We've got some questions we're going to get to, but I asked you to give me your 3 guys that you really want to take a look at. So give me your 3, who, what, when, where, why, and your kind of reasoning behind it as far as the most interesting and maybe the guys you'd like to see in Portland in 2 weeks.
Well, I mean, the name that we probably heard the most attached to Portland, just because of where he's at and where he would fit on a timeline, is Saddiq Bey, who out of Villanova. He's he fits perfectly for what this roster needs going into the offseason. Now, granted, you don't know how this is going to look through free agency or who they choose to resign or don't resign, but Saddiq Bey is a guy who's played the 3 and the 4 at Villanova. He's probably, I see him more as a 4 in the NBA.
Which, just to be clear, Portland still doesn't have an answer for.
Yeah.
So for everybody's like, they need help at the 3 and the 4, the ubiquitous forward position.
And so, I mean, Bey with that, I think he had, what's interesting about him and what you rarely get to see in these late lottery or lottery prospects is you've seen him play in two very different roles in his college career, where as a freshman, he was very much a tertiary player, played off of the guys around him, and he was a safety valve. I think that film is more important than what he put up in his second year, where he's putting up these big numbers and shows that he can carry an offense, can do multiple things, is a good decision maker, can pick up a lot of assignments. But I really think the blend of those two, and mainly the emphasis on that first year, is really encouraging for like teams looking that are on the fringe of the playoffs or looking to add a cheap asset to get to there. They might not have the flexibility to go out and get somebody. I think Bey definitely fits that mold. He's someone I'm very interested in for Portland. The other guy is RJ Barrett, or not RJ Barrett. I'm losing my mind.
That's a Freudian slip.
Yeah. Well, no, I'm not looking at RJ Barrett. RJ Hampton, sorry. Ugh. So anyway, RJ Hampton, I mean, similar worries. Yeah, similar worries. I mean, there's not really a lot of outside shooting, and there's this rumor of a reformed shot. I was not hinting at him earlier as far as something that looks uglier. I think his actually does look better.
Well, I mean, the original was not good. It was a beta. It was that jump shot was still in beta. The new one looks like it might be okay for public release. That's the difference.
Improvement is improvement. So we're not getting a force close on your app on your phone when this shot goes up.
Yeah.
So his shot's better. He played in Australia. Like LaMelo, these guys really didn't play a lot in Australia. And actually, in Australia, the team that RJ played on in New Zealand, he played for the New Zealand team there. That team was better when he wasn't on the floor, which is not always a good sign. But
there's a big but here. There's a major difference. I know the guys in the Ringer, Vernon and O'Connor, talked about this a couple weeks ago, but I wanted to kind of hit on it a little bit. The difference between playing college basketball and playing in the NBL is night and day. Those NBL teams, everybody talks about, the Dukes would go in the NBA and win a game. They could go to the EuroLeague and win a game. No, they can't. Grown-ass men will go out there and punk these kids night in, night out. The only guys who can hang are the Ja Morants, the Zions of the world, the guys that are no doubt NBA caliber dudes the second they get there.
That have a frame that can support their skills.
Yes.
And that's just –
RJ does not. LaMelo does not. But in the long run, I think for those guys and guys going forward, it is better for them to go there and get punched in the face. It's not good for their draft stock, but it's good for them mentally, physically, to go there and learn how to play as a professional.
Exactly.
More than anything.
And it's not really what's going on the floor in those games. Like you said, it's learning how to be in a pro facility, in a pro coaching staff, having a workout regimen, a diet plan specifically worked out for you. I think really, and I joked in my profile that I did on RJ about how I could really copy paste his fit from Anthony Simons.
Yep.
And I say that for a reason, mainly because the way that RJ can create separation and
world
get
class
to his shot are the same. Now, RJ's shot is behind where Ant's is significantly. Like, it looks a little prettier, but Ant has that mid-release that
it's Dame-esque. It gets off immediately. And I don't think, and then again, this is me gushing about Ant, I don't think I've ever seen anybody close out and actually bother Ant's shot, even though it's a low release point, because he gets it off so fast. And RJ, and this is something that we've talked about, you and I, both privately and publicly at least, about this team. The Portland Trail Blazers are the least athletic team in the entire NBA, and I will stand by that. Mm-hmm. Outside of a couple flashes, Nurkic moves really well for a big dude. He's still 7 foot, 300 pounds. He's still mammoth. Zach moves well for a 7-footer. Dame has some of the best excel, decel probably in the NBA. CJ is very shifty. But you just go down these guys. There's 2 guys on this team who I go, those are explosive athletes. That's Ant and Nas. Gary moves well, but I don't look at Gary and go, that's a world-class NBA explosive level athlete. And yes, there's levels to this. They're all great athletes. I'm not calling them bad athletes. We're grading on the NBA scale. Portland could do something to look at a guy like RJ in that vein alone.
I think too, with what you see with a lot of Portland is you rarely see the the size and the athleticism line up at the same time.
Yes.
Like that is very non-existent. And like, that's why I think a guy like Wenyen Gabriel becomes kind of a cult hero in Portland, because
explosive athleticism.
You see what it's like to have a quick twitch athlete that has the frame to back it up. And that's going to be a theme that you're going to see me hit on consistently as we move through some of these other questions. But RJ, getting back to RJ real quick, he is definitely that type of athlete. He's a high flyer. He's just, a lot of his problems are tied to, I believe, fixable problems. Some shot mechanics, which he's obviously addressed. He's been working with Mike Miller since the season ended. And really,
Remind me, Mike Miller, good guy to work with, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So, especially in that department, especially in the shooting department. I think he's a guy who, defensively, he's going to be a plus eventually when he gets there. But a lot of his problems, it's funny to watch him because the way he gets caught on a screen, we watched it happen to CJ and Dame for 3 years. Yep. And we know that is a fixable problem if the investment is made by the player. And I think by everything I've seen and heard about RJ Hampton,
he works.
He is going to make that type of investment. Last is, I saved him for last because he's a guy I've been fascinated with since this process started, is Isaac Okoro. There he is this Auburn wing that is a lockdown defender who I am confident could come in and play NBA minutes and defend from day one. Offensively, yeah, it's not ideal. His shot is behind where he's at, but I give his offense more credit than most people do because I don't think he avoids mistakes that he can prevent. So, yes. He doesn't dribble into trouble. He can play through contact when he has to. He's not a ball stopper. Those are things that you can really mitigate your deficiencies when you're good at avoiding those things until they catch up with the rest of your game. Now, granted, Okoro's a little bit outside of Portland's draft range, but overall,
we don't know what's going to happen in this, though. Yeah. One of these wings is going to go tumbling. One of these guys, like a ball, is going to go tumbling, and that draft order is just going to get shot to hell. Mm-hmm. That's what's going to happen. So it's a good idea to even mention some of these guys that may go in that 7, 8, 9, 10 range, even though Portland's obviously a bit behind that even.
Well, I outside of that, I guarantee there's going to be someone who's going to fall in this draft, and it's going to be surprising. I mean, Portland ended up with
one last year.
Yeah. So, but outside of that, everything you're hearing is you have a lot of trade partners that are wanting to trade back. Mm-hmm. And I mean, granted, everybody in this draft, I feel like they want to trade back. And I want to clear up a misconception on that is it doesn't mean that this is a terrible draft class. I mean, there's just a lot of question marks, and there's a lot of guys. I imagine everybody's board is different. So you might think this guy is going to fall to you and to your team where you're at, and he very well could. There's this range of 10 to 45 where pick your poison in that range, really. So, but if Portland does want to move up, they have the assets to do it. Mm-hmm. They have those smaller assets. And I don't think it's going to take much to move up in this draft.
It all depends on as long as it's outside of the top 8, from basically 9 on, Portland has ready-made assets to move into the top 9. Or the 9, 10, 11 range. If one of those wings is there and they really want him, they can go get him relatively easily. They have the pieces necessary to make that happen.
And I think Okoro's a super interesting guy. I think he's that rare blend where I think you could get some production in Dame's prime years, and he's a guy who could develop on the offensive side going forward to be that complete two-way player.
I'm going to put you on the table here. If Portland's there to pick, let's say they trade up to 10. This is going to be somewhat reminiscent of 2017. Okoro and Patrick Williams are available. Who are you taking?
No, I can go on my Florida State rant, but I'm taking Okoro.
Oh, really?
Easy.
Okay.
Because here's what I don't like about both the Florida State wings, Vassell and Williams, is I watched Matisse Thybulle, who is not as good of an athlete than those two, put up double the steal numbers in the same zone system. And those guys at Florida State have never they play zone defense. yes, they get a lot of turnovers, and they can sell out on defense.
Mm-hmm.
They are not going to have that luxury at the next level.
True.
And granted, I could very much eat my words with both these Florida State guys, as Kyle likes to remind me every time he does a profile on a Florida State guy, because I won't do them. So I'm like, I'm way too harsh on this team. But
just remember, who does Patrick Williams profile a lot like?
Was it?
Who else was at Florida State and had a lot of these same things and is probably going to be a DPOY player for the majority of his career?
We'll see if he can stay healthy. So
True. But when I looked at and then again, I'm not anti-Okoro. You know where I stand on Okoro. I think he's a hell of a prospect. But I look at a guy like Patrick Williams, and he's that guy for me this year where, you know me, I always get attached to one guy where I'm like, they're going to end up being pretty good. And I watch tape of him, and I just hear what his coaches say. There's a lot of things that are reminiscent to a guy who, and this, I think there's some truth to this. We talked about this a little bit earlier. The coachability with a guy like RJ, and a guy who will really commit. And Okoro, I've heard, is the same way. There are guys who no doubt want to improve and get after things. And I look at Williams, and I see him as an NBA-ready guy because he can come in, and the shot's already workable. It's not great, but it's certainly workable. But the length, the athleticism, the explosion, and the dedication to get better are all there. And I think he fits better on a team that's closer than Portland is, but I also can very easily see him being a guy that after a month or two could ramp up, and kind of like what we saw with Gary Trent Jr. this year, where it wouldn't be the offensive impact, but it would be the defensive impact. And I think he would be more like what maybe Portland thought Collins would be at the 4 spot, being a little bit more twitchy, being a little bit more instinctive on the perimeter. But again, I think Okoro could address those same concerns and maybe slide down and be a little bit more of a 3.
And I think Okoro, I mean, really, and just to be clear for those who aren't listening that aren't completely obsessed with Florida State basketball, we're talking about Johnathan Isaac previously. But I don't think we ever said that. I just want to be very clear about that. I think Okoro does a lot of those same things. It's just it's a shift up in position where it's the small forward shooting guard.
It's a 2-3 to 3-4. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And I think Okoro is a guy who eventually is going to be able to guard a power forward on a switch. I mean, it's not where you want to see him all the time.
It's a lot like what we see with Gary. Gary can guard 1-2, no problem. Him sliding up to the 3, a couple possessions here or there, in his shift, that's okay. But you don't want to see Gary as your 3 having to go up against a Kawhi, a PG, a LeBron. Like, you don't – he's just – like, as hard as he worked against LeBron in the playoffs, and he did make him work.
Yeah.
There's no room to make up 5 inches and 50 pounds. You've got to – Portland, if anything else, they have got to find a way to get bodies that are that NBA prototype thick boy. I mean, they need thick boys with a lot of C's. That's the big takeaway. All right, let's get into some of the listener questions here. Christopher Mazzeo at Maz Northwest, assuming all the top tier wings are gone at 16. So all your wings are gone. All of them, Steve. All of them. Who do you suggest the Blazers pick?
I think we've talked about this a little bit before we went on air, but I think Cole Anthony is a guy who I've been impressed with. Yes, it's another guard for Portland, but like you said, the framing of this question is no wings.
The wings
available.
are gone.
In this point, I would say you can always find a cheap third big, I think, no matter what, in free agency. So why not invest more in the backcourt long term? I think Cole Anthony is that guy who has the modern skill set as a scorer. He can score from all 3 levels. I think North Carolina is a disaster for these top picks, top prospects. I think
you just say disaster in general.
Yeah, there was zero spacing for Cole Anthony last year, and he's some guy. He was a guy I was very low on when I went into this process, and when I went back and watched a few games, I was very impressed with what he could do with the amount of attention that was on him, and then also outside of his time at North Carolina. I mean, me and you had the privilege of going and watching a private practice for the USA team last year at the Nike facility.
And who looked like a god tier player among men?
And Cole Anthony is that guy, but not only on the court, but he's a guy that everybody look to when you're getting in and out of the next drill.
Yep.
He's also a guy who goes over and stands with his dad, Greg Anthony, and Andre Miller, and they're talking about the game.
Running through everything.
He's a point guard's point guard.
Yep.
And those guys, I think, are set up for success at the next level. And I mean, it would just be a cool story to see him come to Portland.
He was born here.
Yeah, born here. Greg is still very much attached to the city. He's always fond to the of the Portland area. So I think even if there's a couple wings in that range that are on the board, I think Cole Anthony should still get a long look from the Blazers.
Cole Anthony was a top 3 prospect coming into this season. Cole Anthony, and this is again to steal a little bit from Chris Vernon, and it's kind of irritating because this is the same thing you and I have talked about with Greg or with Cole Anthony. Michael Jordan Invitational or Jordan Brand Invitational. Who was the MVP?
It was Cole Anthony, wasn't it?
Hoop Summit. Cole Anthony.
Okay.
Yeah.
Nico had a good game too.
He did. But McDonald's All-American game. Who's the MVP? Cole Anthony. When the best come out and the best play, who shows out every single time? Cole Anthony. We saw it in those scrimmages. We saw it in the practices. And you want to talk about like controlling a huddle, controlling a team. There are so many guys out there who can go out and get buckets. There's never a shortage of those guys. There is a shortage of guys who know how to run a team. And if Portland has shown anything, and I've certainly been against some of Olshey's picks in his time here, but when it comes to finding guys who have high basketball IQs, they hit those. They hit those every single time. Gary knows the damn game, and he's a pedigree guy. Dame and CJ. Ant is a guy who is a grinder. Nas lives in the gym. The guys they go after, they are hoopers. And I don't say that as like a homer. I've seen the work that goes into these guys. I've seen the stuff that they do off camera. I've talked to these guys. Like the stuff that goes these guys, even if it doesn't translate, the guys that they're going after every single time, I think it may be even to their fault sometimes, is they typically go for the guys who understand the game and have that high level basketball IQ and see the game differently and not just the athletic profile.
Well, I don't think this is by accident for 2 reasons. I think this is the natural progression of Paul Allen when he was still with us, was very much interested in the draft process. And he was also very interested in never being burned by another era like the Jailblazers era. And so you saw a totally different type of player, starting with Brandon Roy, being drafted by the Blazers. And the other thing, too, is just recently, Portland has a tremendous reputation with developing players. But that starts with the identifying, the attitudes, the player profiles of guys who are going to come in and work and have worked at a high level.
Pat Connaughton at Notre Dame, Jake Lehman from Maryland. We're not talking about blue blood programs here. Mm-hmm. But obviously Duke is, but they bring in a Rodney Hood who is known as a guy who, again, is a guy that fits that same kind of thing. Even though he had not necessarily flamed out, but had some rough patches, but who character-wise and basketball-wise, understands the game. Now, there have been some other guys maybe a little bit more questionable that were recently added to the team, but we won't get into that.
Well, it doesn't always work out. Like, by that same frame, Kent Bazemore should have been a slam dunk.
Should have been a great fit. Evan should have been a great fit.
Didn't work.
Again, those are the kind of guys that they typically go for. And to me, Cole Anthony is certainly a guy that if he was there, it would be very hard for me to go against. But I'm going to do something really stupid, Steve. You know who I'm going to take? Poku.
I don't know. Who?
Poku.
Oh, okay.
Pokushevski. Portland needs a unicorn, man. They need one of these guys. They need one of these profiles. And yes, there's a kid coming out of France in a year who's probably even more talented. But if he develops into what people think he's going to be, he's not gonna be there in the top 3 after the top 3 picks. So Pokushevski is a guy who he looks damn good on paper. He definitely needs to put on weight, but you can say that about everybody in this draft, basically, not named Wiseman, Okoro, or Edwards. They're kids. That's whenever I hear somebody say, "Oh, they need to put on weight or they need to get on size," like, yeah, no kidding, they're kids. And unless they're a junior or a senior in college, they're coming out and they still a little iffy. And for anybody who's kind of wondering why I'm going through this, go ahead and take a look at Ant draft night, and go look at Ant's videos from a week ago, and tell me that he doesn't look drastically different as a human being. He went from a kid to a grown ass man. Like and he doesn't weigh all that much more. It's just the way his body is distributed now. But Poku offers so many unique things. Having somebody with size that can put the ball on the floor, knock down shots, be an elite passer that you can run an entire offense through. Hell, even if he only, this is air quotes, only became Porzingis, that uniqueness of that skill set at that size is just so tantalizing. But yes, and everybody out there rolling their eyes or throwing things at me right now as they're listening to this because it doesn't help the timeline right now. Yeah, no kidding. But I like to dream. I like to have a little bit of fun with this kind of stuff. And again, all the wings are gone. So go best play available and see what happens.
My 2 cents on Poku is this. He's one of the strangest players I've ever evaluated film on.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, he was one of the guys I was very lucky that most of his under 18 European Championship games were available.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I base the majority off of it is because he played in the Greek second division.
Which makes it hard to evaluate.
Those videos are hilarious.
Yes.
It looks like he's playing at middle school gyms against middle schoolers. And
which they could be.
But totally possible. What I think about with him is this. What I like about his game is there's a long history of guys who hit 7 feet, but they hit it late. They were in that 6'3" range when they got into basketball.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why you see him have the guard skills that he has. It's very similar to what Anthony Davis brings to the table as far as ball skills. And if he hits even a fraction of that potential, you're looking at an absolute game changer. I think on the money front, I think Poku offers a very interesting opportunity for teams that are really looking to work around the margins in this kind of uncertain time, because I think there's a real possibility that you stash him for a year, which I know that is nails on a chalkboard for Blazers fans, but
shout out Petteri Koponen.
Yeah. That guy's still balling too. He's
playing for like Olympiacos, isn't he?
Yeah, and he plays for the Finnish national team still.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, he's actually.
Yeah, I thought I saw a picture with him and Wade Baldwin once. I could be wrong, but I could. He's on one of the upper echelon European League teams.
Yeah.
I saw a picture of him. I was like, oh crap, Pettery's still playing. Cool, good for him.
Yeah,
get the bag.
Anyway, back on subject. I think you could stash him for a year and bring him over. And really just try to maximize whatever flexibility you have to go after a veteran now. And if you're looking at trying to really maximize Dame's prime years, that might be the move at 16. So,
I mean, if it frees up a little bit more money that's committed to that draft pick, sure, I can see it. But yeah, I think there are certainly some things that Portland can do if the wings are gone. And again, I don't think Cole will be a bad pick. If I'm looking like best player available, swing for the fences. Like if there's ever a year to swing for the fences on a pick, this is the year. There's going to be so much volatility from this draft. And when we get done, there's going to be a couple players that come out of this draft that are absolute monsters. There's never been a year, never, even when the draft is so-called down, that we don't find a guy who's an eventual basically Hall of Fame caliber talent.
Well, this is the total year where it's, Giannis was the 13th, 14th pick.
13th pick in 2010.
And is an MVP. And I could see this being a complete repeat of that somewhere in here. And there's
Jokic was a 42nd pick?
Yeah. So.
I mean, there's always going to be – and the thing is, I'm not saying that the Portland is going to get that guy. I'm just saying that every year there are guys that nobody's – Jimmy Butler was, a late guy. I mean, hell, if you want to look for most recent – and not the fact that he's a complete stud, he's a hell of a player, Gary Trent Jr., second-round pick. Mm-hmm. And he's legitimate two-way starter in the NBA. I would have no problem if Portland had didn't have CJ McCollum, if Gary Trent Jr. was rolling out there as my starter next year and they had a CJ level player at the 3, I wouldn't bat an eye. And that's not even like me like trying to trade CJ. I know.
This is not a real stretch from reality of you imagining a world without CJ McCollum.
It's not. I know. But in all seriousness, this is not a knock on CJ, but it's more of like an uplifting point of like where I think Gary's at. I think Gary Trent Jr. is a starting caliber 2 in this league, and that's from a second round guy. So there's plenty of opportunity for Portland to kind of get ahead here. Overall draft, how do you think this is all going to shake out? What do you think is going to be your big takeaway? And then we'll push into free agency and some trades.
I think this is a draft where you're going to see some big clashes between the scouting department and the front offices and a lot of these guys. And I think, we've touched on LaMelo Ball a lot already, and there's already some scuttlebutt coming out of Golden State where ownership would like LaMelo if Wiseman's off the board, and the scouting department is hell no. So I think that's going to be
– PR department's also saying hell no.
And I think you're going to see that in a lot of – I think there's a lot of prospects that a lot of guys don't see eye to eye on. It's going to cause a lot of friction. And if it goes poorly, I think you're going to see a lot of jobs come available because of some decisions that were made on this draft night. And I think that is one of my biggest takeaways from this class.
Which is why you're seeing so many guys who normally wouldn't get phone calls, get phone calls. Mm-hmm. All right, let's get into free agency / trades. This is going to kind of be worked in. This is kind of this. You know what? Screw it. I'm going to roll it back one just because I want to get your kind of take on my absolute disaster piece of an article last week. Mm-hmm. What's your ideal trade package or in return for CJ? And that's from I'm Rip City 07 Hayden Tompkins. If you're moving CJ, who and what are you moving him for? I know you've got him because I've sent you a million fictional trades. You hate.
I try to stay away from this really because I've spent way too much time that I would like to admit on this.
And yours is nowhere near mine.
Yeah, no, I don't even hold a candle to that for my own sanity. So I think it's what you always kind of look for. I think the one that's always been interesting for me, or not always, but in the last 6 months, is the Sixers have obviously kind of come up as a logical trade partner. Not that I think it will actually happen, but I really like the idea of trading CJ and getting a potentially transcendent talent in a package like a Joel Embiid who doesn't necessarily fit right now, but there would be a secondary trade that you would make, obviously, if you have 2 centers on your roster. It would take a lot. It would take a lot of picks.
For those that were wondering, that's Steve saying he's going to trade Jusuf Nurkic without actually saying it out loud.
Hey, that is that's exactly what I'm saying.
It's physically painful to say. I know. Trust me, I get it. But if you're gonna move the big fella, it's gonna be for the best center in the NBA, and that's. I mean,
I think you make those high variance moves that you see a lot of, like what Daryl Morey did in Houston. Is you just roll the dice and you see what's going to happen, and you give
it a real chance.
The high potential of a Damian Lillard, Joel Embiid pick and roll is something that could just eviscerate even the best teams in the West.
I mean, that's the kind of combination that opens up AD and LeBron. Mm-hmm. That's how good potentially those that Dame Embiid could be together. And for those wondering, if you're talking about size real quick, I want to throw a little thing on Embiid since you brought him up. He had the highest points per possession rating in the modern NBA last season in the post-up. 1.2 points per possession. That's absurd. For anybody who doesn't understand 1.2, that's you're on par, actually above Damian Lillard in the pick and roll level of points per possession, which is unheard of level of efficiency in what is supposed to be the least efficient possession in the game in the post-up. That's how good he was at a high volume.
And he's doing it in a lineup that features a point guard that can't shoot outside of 6 feet. So imagine what he could do with a couple like a shooter like Damian Lillard, who has
Damian on one side and Gary in the short corner.
Yep, be unreal.
So you're swinging for the fences. That's where you're going.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. if you're gonna break up that level of continuity, it better
break it all up.
It better be for a move that's going to put you. You have to sell that, I would imagine, to Damian Lillard as this is a move that has the potential to make you a clear title favorite. And I think any move that falls short of that is not worth entertaining. So that's why I don't give a crap about your Aaron Gordon trades. I don't give a crap about your Tobias Harris base trades.
Well, that's a bad trade anyways.
That's moving deck chairs around. I don't.
So if you're going to move CJ, you're going to move CJ with Nurk, and really go all in. You're going
to put. I mean, it's just what the Lakers did for LeBron this year. You're going to put another top 10 player around your best player to open a title win,
and then let everything else fall where it may.
Yep.
I'm not against it. Well, I mean, you know me. I'm title or bust kind of guy. So, all right, this one from Brandon Niles at 2 Guys. Brandon, Ariza Collins and a first seems like the best way to combine assets and contract value to get a trade going. What are the odds we use something like that to go after a big upgrade somewhere, and who might it be? Oladipo, Hield, Covington? Any of those you think those are achievable or desirable?
I think Covington's interesting. I don't necessarily know if that's the trade package. You'd have to remind me on the cap workings of how Ariza's cap value holds up in a trade, since it's not guaranteed. Is it just
the 12 will be the 12 will be guaranteed? Yeah. So
in a trade. Okay.
Yeah. So it works that way.
So I was under the impression that it was the opposite, which I granted I'm a little gray on that one. So in that case, yeah, I mean that's a way you can build up salary with some interesting assets. Now, I think right now you're selling tremendously low on Zach Collins, and I think at this point it's kind of a sunk cost thing where I think really the focus of this next year is that Zach Collins evaluation of where do you go from there? What do you really have? I think of those guys that were mentioned, I think Robert Covington's an interesting name because obviously there's been a change. He was brought in by a previous regime. Robert Covington is kind of a specialty type player where he's that fourth piece you kind of plug into your team. And if the new Rockets setup does not see him as that fourth piece or as a luxury, he could be someone that would be very interesting to put a phone call in on. Granted, I think there's 29 other teams that are making that phone call too, but at least I think that is a very interesting one. I think his fit is natural inside Portland's setup as far as him being a guy who can pick up most players on the court at any time. I mean, he got a little exposed guarding point guards in the bubble this year, but I think for the most part, he'd be a massive upgrade defensively, and he can shoot from the corner.
Those shadows you see casting over the Houston Rockets, that's the vultures of the NBA circling ready to pick the carcass that is left behind by Daryl Morey. And I don't think this is like a Daryl Morey problem per se, for those that may or may not be aware. The whole Russell Westbrook thing, just read between the lines on why that trade occurred. Just, shouldn't be hard to see him. So I don't necessarily hang the Westbrook hat on him. I'd say before that, he was a Chris Paul hamstring away from being in the NBA Finals. So I'm willing to give Morey pretty much all of the leash that he wants there. As we look at this kind of group of players, Oladipo's a guy, you know me. I've always wanted to add him to this team. I wouldn't trade CJ straight up for him. I wouldn't, especially now with the injury stuff. But would you be willing to add a little something salary-wise if you got a little more in return to get Depot and Warren, or Depot and Brogdon, whatever the situation may be? Would you be willing to basically have him be your sixth man, where he's your primary initiator?
I think that role could work. It could be clunky. I mean, that's a lot of money to pay a sixth man, especially when you have other needs on your roster.
Mm-hmm.
Hitting back to something we talked about earlier, Depot is a hooper's hooper. That guy grinds. He comes back from, one good way to look at it too is that guy comes back from, and which sometimes to his detriment, comes back from his injuries early.
Soon.
And so I think it would be interesting. I just don't know if you're going to make that type of a big deal trade, I would hope you would have something lined up for CJ to address that front court. Now, TJ Warren is interesting, but I think if the Blazers were seriously interested in TJ Warren, they could have got him for nothing, very similar to what Indiana got.
The Pacers got him for? which still is just mind-blowing to me. Portland's struggling to find help at the small forward position, and there's basically a T-bone steak being dangled in front of you. Or perhaps Phoenix doesn't want to trade him, in conference, and that's why he ends up in Indiana, and maybe they had other offers. But as far as what I would expect to be packaged up, that kind of goes along with what I expect. Ariza, Collins first. I think those are your first three things that you target right now. If I had to peg it, as much as I know they still believe in Collins, and that's their guy, I still think that there's more belief in Ant being an absolute stud by the time he hits his full development cycle than there is in Collins. And that's not an anti-Zach thing. I still, like I've said a billion times, I still think Zach is going to be an NBA player and stick around the league and be a rotation big his whole career. That's been the same place I've been with Zach since he was drafted. But I still think that around the league, Ant is looked at as a guy that, while raw and did have a down year last year, his potential cap is still so high that keeps him from being involved in trades like this unless a real difference maker is coming back in return. Are you on the same level, or are you still pulling Zach back from the pile?
It's just two different scales. Like, I just think the investment in Zach is significantly higher
because the capital they gave up to move up.
Yeah, and just really some of the moves they may have made or did not make because they were banking on his development. I think, yes, those are sunk costs, but I think that's what this year is you got to see what you have. I don't think they move him just because I think, judging by Neil's history, I think there's too much investment here and there's too much that hinges on here from what was packaged to get up there to get him. And this was Neil's pick, and I think you're going to see what it pans out to be.
And for those that didn't read the article last week, Neil Olshey has never traded a rotation player that has years left on his deal. And right now, with the controlled cost of Zach Collins, it's basically essentially the same way. The only time I'm trying to think of the only time that they let an RFA go, and that was the sign and trade with Jake Layman. That's it. I can't think of any others that they let go, especially of guys that they drafted. So it's kind of like, okay. So, all right, let's get on to the next question here. This from the homie, Big Oli Castle. Give us your best Jrue Holiday trade involving the Blazers and Pelicans. Zion for a first. Oh, Jrue Holiday trade. My bad. Listen, I've been an advocate for Jrue for a couple of years. I think we're at the point where that no longer makes any sense. Mm-hmm. It doesn't, because they're not going to trade him straight across for CJ. Yeah, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, maybe, but.
In my notes, I just wrote, there's no trade that makes anyone happy. That's what I wrote. And it's just, I guess my thing would be is, I guess if you did a CJ Jrue swap, I think
it makes Portland better.
I think both sides would be asking for young assets for the other, and I think both sides perceive they're in a position of power in that trade.
Yeah.
And I guess the young asset that I could see I would most come down for would be like Didi Silva, they stashed him in Australia last year. He's a guy we watched at Hoop Summit. He's legit. I think he's a name everybody needs to remember. And he's coming over this year. So, but still, like that's going to be a very tough sell for Portland fans.
Yeah. I think it would make Portland better. I think it would make sense, and I think it would make New Orleans better, both in the immediacy. But I don't think it makes sense for both teams, because neither gets to admit they won the trade. Mm-hmm. And these are, I think, in organizations that, because they're quote unquote smaller markets, you have to win the trade. And New Orleans, the next 5 trades they're in that involves a player of consequence, they have to win them because of the AD stuff. Mm-hmm. Like the optics behind that. Otherwise, it becomes the team that can't keep their stars. The team that can't keep guys happy. And that stuff matters. I don't care what you're saying or shaking your head to or any of that. If you're listening to this, that stuff matters to players, agents, and executives.
Well, they're already building the case to keep Zion already.
They're already fighting against it.
Yep.
Like if you don't truly understand or recognize that right now, that's what they're already fighting against. All right. So all right, after a quick commercial break, we're back. What's funny is in post-production, I'm absolutely 100% putting the ad read right there.
Perfect.
Yeah, all right.
This is sponsored by Oregon Craft Beer that makes my bladder very full.
All right, let's get to some free agency stuff, and we haven't even really touched on this yet. Free agency is going to start basically the second the draft ends legally. In real life, free agency's already started.
Absolutely.
Nobody gives one bleepity bleeping bleep about tampering this offseason. Not one bit. That probably has a lot to do with the fact that a superstar isn't going to be changing teams via free agency, whereas if this was next year, that would not be the case. I have a feeling that next year, come Giannis's free agency, that stuff's going to be monitored pretty heavily. What that could mean for small markets going forward. There's going to be some owners who are going to be pretty pissed off if they don't at least give the assumption or the preface that it's kind of being looked at. So let's get this one out of the way. At River Wellness, Matthew, Gallo, Jerami Grant, Jae Crowder have all spoken as possible Blazer free agent targets. Are any of these reasonable gets for Portland, or should we expect a free agent from the next tier down? I'm going to touch this one first because I want to dash all hopes. No, and no. I'd love them. All three of them would solve a lot of problems for Portland. Grant and Crowder specifically on the defensive end, Gallo leaning into the offensive end where it would be one hell of a regular season team. Like Dame CJ Gallo Nurkic would be a nightmare cover night in, night out, especially with the way that we're looking at games being played in the series. Cool, we're going to pick and roll you to death with multiple combinations, 1-4, 1-5, 2-4, 2-5. Oh, and we're going to throw somebody out there at the three who's just going to rim run and back cut on you endlessly. You know, I could see it. Or we're going to park Gary Trent Jr. in the corner and run him off every action or every screen can be slipped. Gallo can dive, Nurk can dive, both can pop, and you've got to deal with Dame and CJ in a pick and roll where if you go under one of these screens, you're going to get cooked. Like in a regular season, sign me up. But this is all a fantasy. It's not happening. Denver's keeping Jerami Grant. Kroenke's finally going to open up his damn wallet because they legitimately have a path. If Michael Porter Jr. pops on a rookie deal, which is – it's feasible. It is. Like he's not going to play a lick of defense, but it doesn't matter if you can come in and score 20 and 20. Like
he has the talent and size to be a difference maker.
He's 6'10" and can take anybody in the league off the bounce. Mm-hmm. Oh, and by the way, he can absolutely stroke the living hell out of him from three. Mm-hmm. He has no doubt superstar potential. I don't care what you say about the Nuggets, this, that, or the other. Oh, yeah, and also Jamal Murray looks like he's on that same trajectory that we saw Damian Lillard on. Like what him and Donovan Mitchell showed is that those guys are superstar guards who are going to fill in behind Dame when he's gone. Mm-hmm. So Denver's all in. You're not getting him. And everything that I have heard about Jae Crowder, every single thing I have heard about him out of Miami is he is 100% committed to that culture. As much as I would love to see him here, but there's also a caveat to that. Jae Crowder's in a contract year. Contract year, get Jae Crowder shoots better than actual Jae Crowder. So you're still looking at a Minu-esque three-point shooting, but much more fluid defense. You're probably going to overpay. So my answer to this is, number one, all would be great, all are ungettable, the next tier down. Also with Crowder and Gallo, you're probably paying more for past production than you are future production. Grant's the only one in here I think you're paying for future production, which is what you should be doing in free agency. Mm-hmm. Did I snuff it all out for you? You got anything else?
I think just to cherry on top with that was not only would I say looking at the next tier down, I would say you probably need to look 2 tiers down from free agents in that, unfortunately. I would just say Grant and Crowder are in winning situations where they can stay in winning situations.
And one of them's in Miami.
And Gallo is trying to get to that type of situation. And I think Portland has a very competitive roster when healthy, but let's face it, they're not the Miami Heat right now, and they're not the Denver Nuggets right now. I mean, yes, Portland beat the Nuggets in the playoffs last season, but it's a different team. Bounds and improvement. And if you were going to create a front court player in a lab to play next to Nikola Jokic, it would be Jerami Grant.
Yes.
And I think his agent has to see that. He has to see that, and he has to see what potential.
And it's not like he's going to take less money there. Like
No.
he's going to get his, not a max, but he's going to get basically his full allowance. He's going to get that 15, 17 million a year. In a year where it's not going to make sense for anybody to give it to him because of the unsure financial cycle that we're in right now, he's still going to command that money. And so, place you want to be in a winning situation where the culture makes sense and you're going to get the bag. Granted, it's not a premier destination, but they've done enough, I think, to show that they're committed to winning and having a culture that's not dysfunctional. And Grant's not a kid. So he's been around long enough to know. Obviously, he's got guys in the league that, you know, he can talk to that will let him know that, hey, you've got it good there. And I think we're seeing more of that happen where guys are trying to get out of bad situations or more likely to stay in a good situation.
Well, he has a father and an uncle to look directly at those type of situations.
Yes.
So I think he's a lock to stay in Denver.
Yeah, as much as I would, again, he would be the perfect four. As much as he's perfectly fit to play alongside Nikola Jokic, he's equally so against Jusuf Nurkic. That's exactly the kind of guy you're looking for. All right. Let's kind of get a little bit more free agency here from Wayne Hughes at Sue's Fellow. More than likely, Neil will just work on the fringes of free agency. Let's say no large trades are made. Safe assumption. Please cover those low-cost free agency vet players. That makes sense. I'm going to let you take this one since I rambled out the first one. I know I asked you to come up with a couple here. So who did you come up with?
Like I said, this is not going to be a fun list for most Portland listeners.
This tier goes down, but there's functional players here.
There's guys here where I think there's been a very common theme with what the Blazers chase on the fringes. They chase untapped potential, and I think they just chase a veteran that has untapped skill set or a veteran with like one functional skill, i.e. Anthony Tolliver. So I would say, Derek Jones Jr. has been a guy who's been brought up. I still think he might be outside of Portland's price range just because of his age. He's only 23 years old.
He's still a kid. It feels like he's been in the league forever, but he's still a kid.
The other guy, and this is, again, not a very, inspiring name, but Michael Kidd-Gilchrist, I think, is a guy who can add some defensive versatility. It sounds like the Knicks are rumored to be interested in him. And with the level of tampering that's going on, there's probably already a contract in place.
And who has a truckload of money?
Yeah. The Knicks are one of the few teams that are operating with –
the Knicks and the Hawks are the two teams that have more money than anybody else right now. They can do basically whatever they want, especially – and they're going to miss out on somebody they really want, and they're going to throw a bunch of money at a guy that they shouldn't and go get the bag, whoever that is.
But Kidd-Gilchrist is – he's a guy who Portland collects 2012 lottery picks like Pokemon cards.
Yep.
So, I think he fits that system. He's just a guy you can put in there and he can – guard multiple positions. He's not going to –
in the bubble, he looked good too. Like he was functional offensively. Defensively, there's zero questions about Michael Kidd-Gilchrist.
And then a guy, we and you have both talked about, both really liked him when he was coming out, is Josh Jackson. I think he's a guy who has been –
Put it in my veins. Listen, I know there's some personality stuff. There's some off-the-court stuff that's not pretty. It's not great. But basketball-wise – unquestionable. Perfect fit. And
then just depending on what the Suns do, I think that the guy who's on the top of my list, and granted he's not a clear-cut unrestricted free agent, is Dario Saric. I think he's a guy, even if he's not in that starting role, he's a guy you want to bring off the bench. He can play next to Zach. He can play next to Nurk. I think he's just a good basketball player. He has a huge toolbox of skills.
And you're buying low.
And you're buying low on his talent. Now, granted, I think the Suns keep him around, but I think if you threw the full MLE at him, there's a potential that he might come to Portland, but it all just it depends. But I guess if on that, if you're outside of that top tier of like realistic stuff that guys at Portland could throw money at, I think Dario Saric is my guy when you move down a tier of probably the top of my list of guys who I'd want to see in Portland.
Yeah, I'd flip Jackson and Saric, but I think those are the if we're talking about the tiered guys, those are the two guys. Jackson came in from Memphis at the end of the year last year and looked like what he was supposed to be when he came out. Go back and read my tweets heading into that draft. I think I had Josh pegged number 3 on my board. I'm stupid high on the kid, always have been. But there's that whole where you play college at. If you got a Kansas across your chest, just unless you're Joel Embiid, it's kind of hard to. Yeah. It's kind of like North Carolina in that respect. Sorry, Nas. Sorry. But he's toolbox-wise, long, rangy, explosive, can cover 1 through 4, can slide up to the 4 as a legit 4 against small ball lineups, can be a starting level 3, has shown the capacity to knock down shots. If you've got a slider for your free agency guys, he's the slider turned slightly more to the defensive side. Sorry, just slightly turned more to the offensive side. It depends on which one you really like to see. If you're looking for a starter, I think Jackson makes more sense as your starter. I think Sarge makes more sense as your bench guy. Unless you got a guy at the 3 who you trusted defensively, and you could put Sarge at the 4. And I think that would be something you could take a look at. There's a guy in here that we didn't touch on, but we did touch on before the podcast. I love Ant. That's unquestioned. I love Gary. I love Nas. I think all 3 of those guys have a future in the NBA as successful rotation caliber players. None of them are point guards. Ant has worked on this offseason about looking at the floor, reading the floor, anticipating passes, not always having his blinders on, making sure he's trying to score. That's a work in progress. Learning to be a primary initiator ball handler is a difficult thing. I'd argue the most difficult thing in the NBA right now. All the things you have to process. You know who's really good at that kind of stuff? A 32-year-old point guard who's made a living being a floor general, I would say floor raiser point guard. He's not a ceiling raiser by any shape, matter, or form, but he's been successful and consistent everywhere he's been. DJ Augustine. He fits every bit of the mold of guys that they've brought in. High basketball IQ, able to run an offense. He's Tim Frazier on steroids. That's what he is. He's Steve Blake. He's Shabazz when he wasn't gunning towards the end of the season. Let's call it December Shabazz, because once the new year rolled around, he was looking for a contract. Those shots went up a little bit more. But he's a guy that if he's running your second unit, I don't even blink. And here's another one that's probably going to piss some people off, but I'd love it just for the giggles. JJ Barea.
I saw that name on there and I thought about it.
Here's the thing.
Connection.
Exactly. He knows the offense. You would not, in a short camp turnaround, which you do have to worry about when bringing in somebody who's going to run your offense. JJ Barea could absolutely come in and run this offense. Mm-hmm. And if he came in on a vet min deal, I'd be fine. Him or Augustine I would have zero issues with. They would be able to run that unit just fine. You put Ant off ball, let him be a scorer and a secondary facilitator because he showed he wasn't quite ready for that yet. But those are the guys that I would immediately go for. Like if you're looking for that backcourt help, Augustine and Barea. For that somewhat quasi front court help, Jackson and Sarge. Those are I think the 4 guys that you hone in on. Obviously last year we pretty much got all of them right when we put our free agent pegging down. As far as who was going to go where, as far as Portland was concerned, we kind of saw where they were going to go in free agency. This is the early tea leaf reading. I think those are the guys that Portland's definitely going to look at when we're talking about free agency.
I want to add one name in there at the very end, just when you're talking about connection to the city, and hopefully his brother put in a good word in his brief time here. But I think Marc Gasol is a name that would be interesting for Portland too.
Listen, if he doesn't go to Spain, if he is no doubt committed to playing basketball, it would have been worth the jokes of Powell being a Blazer, quote unquote, to get Mark here.
Yep.
And it would push Zach primarily to the 4. But if you're not entirely trusting of Nurk's injuries, and you're not entirely trusting of Zach's injury record so far, you could do worse than getting Marc Gasol or his teammate Serge Ibaka. Yep. Both are guys that I would, if Portland signed them for a partial MLE, like that $5-6 million for a year or two, I'd be okay with that. I would. Well, I think you have to give at least 2 years if you use the partial MLE, or is it 3? It's one of those two. But
yeah, the biannuals too, I think. And
so
then,
and they didn't use their biannual last year, so I would. That's kind of what I would look at. So if Mark retires, you don't have to worry about it anyways. If Ibaka is here for 2 years, cool. I'm okay
just
with
saying.
that.
If you hear this, Amara, put in the phone call. Get Mark here on a discount. All right.
Listen, you know where my heart stands with Big Spain. All right, like that's a guy that before they got Nurk, I wanted. That's my dude. So listen, I with open arms. We can revive the Spanish Armada. We'll call Rudy and Sergio. We can have some parties.
I have a sneaky suspicion Rudy's never coming back to Portland. So.
You think? Yeah. Speaking of big men, speaking of Nurkic, this is the question I think we're going to kind of wrap on, just because we kind of went long on some of the other stuff, but I think this is actually where we'll probably spend the most time. Jrue Elizard Miller, I'm hoping I'm getting your hyphenated name right. Nurkic trajectory. Have we seen his ceiling? How good could he get from here? I'm going to preface this with, when they moved for him after Nurk Fever, you and I talked about him a lot. We had the BE night, we had the dinner and everything. And I remember this because it was one of the few times where I put down a no BS, I think this guy is going to be this unquestioned. And I've reiterated it multiple times on the podcast. Prime Nurkic is 18 points, 12 rebounds, 4 assists, 2 blocks. In the bubble, Nurkic was 18 points, 12 rebounds, almost 4 assists, 1.5 blocks. That is his stat line. He could bump it up and be a 20-14 guy. He could up his assist ratio, but he is who he is right now. That's a damn good player who slots in perfectly alongside Damian Lillard. The only guy I think that you get it's any better is the aforementioned Joel Embiid. Where Nurkic gets better is efficiency. Knocking down threes, being better at the free throw line, and being stronger at the rim. I'm not saying he needs to post up more. I think his post up rate is just fine. And he's not settling for mid-range shots. He's taking shots that he's shown he is capable of hitting. If he can be 36% from three, if he can be better as the short roll man, he's good right now. He's better as a stationary playmaker. But if he can be better as a short roll man, and he can clean up the stuff around the rim, I think those 3 things are the key to him being a very good, no BS, near all-star big. And then we're talking about if he cleans those things up, he's an all-star caliber big. Because right now I have him 5th or 6th in the NBA as far as big men are concerned.
I can see. I just want to touch on a couple of things where it's just outside of I agree with everything you said there. I think we're just starting to see the game on offense slow down for him.
Yeah.
And I think the sky is the limit for him as a facilitator from the post. And I think you're seeing him see that, not quite on a Jokic level, but I mean, if he can get to making some of those plays, it's going to be huge. I think he has a really good feel of making the pass ahead of the defense. And that's something I've really touched on my profile, is how to read a defense instead of just, passing as a safety valve. And I think we've seen that transition from Nurk, and I do believe the game is slowing down. I still think we haven't seen a lot of him play at this lighter weight. I think that could unlock things for him on both ends of the floor. I think when he was forced to switch on defense, when they were playing those 2 center lineups, I think he performed better than I expected him to.
Yes, he did.
If that comes along, that changes how Portland operates. When he's back as a true center and the only center in the lineup, unlocks a door that Terry Stotts walked through once with Mason Plumlee and Myers Leonard, and then immediately shut that and boarded that room up. So I think if you have that type of flexibility, you're starting to see Portland won't be as predictable on defense if he's able to do some of those things differently.
To tag on that, for everybody who wants to beat up Stotts for this, number one, it's a personnel. Stop. It's personnel. Don't argue with me. Stop. Because, and this is not me just like I'm right. This is, let's roll it back to LaMarcus Aldridge playing the 5. Mm-hmm. Go back and look at the tape and look at the numbers behind it. LaMarcus Aldridge playing the 5 even though he didn't want to, how many times did he switch? In high leverage situations when LaMarcus Aldridge was playing the 5 in the playoffs, they were not running drop coverage. When they have had guys that they can trust to make that play. And it was obviously one of the reasons why I was such a huge LaMarcus fan, was because his defense was vastly underrated. He wasn't all world, but he was a no doubt 7-footer who could be the primary hub of your offense and still not get torched on the perimeter as a center. That's so far and few between. If Nurk gets anywhere near that level, that unlocks what they can do a lot more defensively. They don't have to play drop all the time. They could work tagging the – and Nurk did a fantastic job of this against what is going to be a dynamic pick-and-roll pair, hopefully for the entire time they're in their league, Ja Morant and Jaren Jackson. Mm-hmm. Go back and watch the game film in those games in the bubble. What Nurk did defensively was masterclass, tagging on probably the second most explosive point guard in modern NBA history in Ja Morant behind Russell Westbrook. And yes, I'm placing him above Derrick Rose in that capacity. His ability to turn the corner in the pick and roll is obscene. Now, Rose is a straight line driver, is God tier. But in a pick and roll, making that read, Nurk stifled those two more times than I could count. And it was – for him to come back and look like that was incredible to me. To be able to stick with and read Ja, who is one of the most explosive rookies I've ever seen as a point guard, not just athletically, but making you make a decision defensively. And I think that kind of burden, that's what kind of unlocks what Nurkic can do defensively. Obviously, they're a better team with Nurk on the floor. I don't think anybody's arguing that. If you're arguing that, you're insane. Let's be honest. Yeah. But being able to deal with a Jaren Jackson rim roll or a pick and pop and knowing when and where to step out, take away the passing lane while also contesting one of the best young finishers in the league shows you exactly the kind of things that you were hitting on. Mm-hmm. And I think if you're Portland, you have to be excited about that. But statistically, do you think Nurk gets above really what we saw in the bubble?
I don't think so. I think, like you said, I think the efficiency numbers will probably come up, hopefully. But as a total output, I don't see. I think we're approaching the ceiling there. Would be my guess. I think there is a chance for maybe one more assist per game and probably cut down on the turnovers. But
again, we're tightening things up.
Yeah, exactly. I don't see there being any monumental breakthrough. I think a lot of this stuff now, as he approaches the ceiling, is just as important as that total output. It's the intangible things. It's the little things. It's opening up flexibility for the entire team. It's
stepping out offensively and defensively. And offensively to the three-point line. If Nurk can get out to the corner, we're not talking above the break. With a pick and pop up there like Porzingis would be nice. But if Nurk can basically work his way out towards the baseline, off ball, weak side, what that does to a defense when all of a sudden the big has to get out beyond the dunker spot, think about how much more room somebody like a Nasir Little has for a back cut or Ant or somebody who's not Dame or CJ, where the defense is entirely focused all the time. Those tertiary guys have a lot more room to work with if Nurk's on the floor able to do things at 3 levels.
Or I think just something that we've been begging Portland to get better at for the last couple of years is those hockey-style assists where that's something where if Nurkic is out from the high post and he's seeing – and he's already starting to see – this, but you've seen those plays develop. I mean, making that first pass that leads to that, the eventual assist, I think that's something Portland has lacked with this group, and I think that's something that Nurk can definitely change. But it's hard; you're not going to see that in the box score.
Yeah, he can definitely unlock that stuff. Well, speaking of locking and unlocking, there's a few other questions we want to get to, but we're running too late, and I've already kept you too long because it is football Sunday, and I know your Dolphins are getting ready to play. Tua is the driving force behind this. But thanks for joining us, man. Thank you, everybody for getting questions in. For everybody that doesn't know, we are on Spotify now, too. So if you want to get us there, we are available basically anywhere you listen to podcasts, Megaphone, Stitcher, iTunes, Spotify. Again, please rate, review, subscribe. Particularly, I love the reviews that of folks that hate me with a passion. Hate me all you want. Just keep listening, baby. That's all I care about. Keep downloading, keep listening. Check still cash the same.
Jeez.
Listen, man, spiteful listeners is just as good as loving conditional listeners who, we love you guys too. Shout out to everybody who loves the show and keeps coming back. In all seriousness, though, thank you, everybody. It's great to be back. Steve, thank you for coming on, man. Go ahead and plug some stuff. I know you got some more coming out that you've got coming in the next couple of weeks.
I mean, it's just it's an insane race to the finish line for this draft. I will have a lot of stuff. I want to work through a few more profiles before I really kind of zero in on the 3-4 guys I really like for Portland. And that is going to be both in the first and second round, which obviously the second round is a lot harder to project, but we're trying to get a lot of those profiles out. So just stay tuned for that. There'll be at least 1 or possibly 2 per day the rest of the way out.
All right. And with that, we also do have a bit of a draft show coming up. So Steve will be a part of that. I'm trying to work on some other loose ends to bring in some other folks, some BE contributors, as well as some guest analysts. Maybe we can get some active players to talk about their draft process. I'm in the process of kind of pulling those guys in. But basically, because of COVID and my inability to be in an NBC studio with everybody else at the same time, we're going to kind of do things here. We're going to do it live. I want to be able to have some user interaction, stuff like that. So if you guys have thoughts, ideas, definitely stay tuned for that. And we hopefully we can have everybody participate. But again, Steve, thank you for hopping on, man. I appreciate you. Go watch your Dolphins. What is it like get wet? Is that the official?
No, that's not it. No, that's wrong. No, I'm pretty sure that's like the adult shop slogan right there. So it's not that.
No, what is it? Is it is it a little dolphin call? What do Dolphins fans do?
Pick your favorite Ace Ventura quote, and that's what it is.
Okay.
All right. So
is that basically like that is the ethos of the Dolphins fan? All right. So I'm a Raiders fan, man. So it's everything's Death Star and black hole. Like we've got a bunch of stuff that we go off of. Dolphins fans, I don't know. So
just undefeated. Just undefeated. That's
just laces out. That's it.
Laces out.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you again, everybody. Thank you, Steve, for joining us. We'll catch you all next week, and bye.